the woman who stepped off the eastbound stage in Colton Creek, Nevada, on a Tuesday morning in September of 1878 was carrying nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer tucked into her boot, and the name of a man who had been dead for 6 weeks. Maude Bristol, or rather, Maude Halcott, as she had been born in Cincinnati 26 years prior, had married Edmund Bristol in the spring of that year with every honest intention a woman could muster. Edmund had been tall and persuasive and full of promises about land he claimed to own out west, a cattle operation near the Nevada Territory that would make them both comfortable for the rest of their natural lives. He had shown her the deed. He had shown her the letter from his so-called foreman. He had kissed her hand and called her his treasure, and Maude, who had been practical and unsentimental her whole life, had let herself believe him because she was 26 and tired of the narrow world Cincinnati offered a woman without family money. Edmund Bristol had died of a fever on the train west, somewhere between Missouri and Kansas, and Maude had sat beside his body for 2 hours before she told the conductor, using those 2 hours to think very clearly about what came next. What came next was this: she had a husband's name, a deed to land she had never seen, a letter of introduction to a man called Foreman Dolly, and absolutely no one left on God's earth who could tell her she could not walk into that land and claim it as her own. The deed was real. She had checked it herself before Edmund got truly sick, had held it up to the light and traced the notary's seal with her fingernail. The land was real. 340 acres east of a town called Colton Creek, Nevada, with a creek running through the eastern pasture and enough flat grazing land to run a modest cattle operation. What she had not known, what she could not have known until the stage rolled down Colton Creek's main street on that September Tuesday, was that someone else was already living on it. She knew the moment she walked into the land office that something was wrong, because the clerk, a thin man named Hooper with ink permanently stained into his fingertips, went pale when she set Edmund's deed on his counter and said clearly that she was Maude Bristol, widow, and she had come to claim her property. Hooper stared at the deed. He looked up at her. He looked back at the deed. "Mrs. Bristol," he said carefully, "there may be a complication." "Tell me the complication," she said. "The Bristol parcel, that is, the land listed here. There's a fella been working it going on 2 years now. Name of Merritt, Grant Merritt. He's got a lease agreement filed with this office, signed by a Hooper shuffled papers with the desperate efficiency of a man trying to avoid something, signed by one Edmund Bristol, 18 months ago." Maude was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not confusion but was instead the sorting of facts into their correct order. "So my late husband leased land he also sold to himself via deed," she said. "It appears there may have been some." "He was a fraud," she said, not bitterly, only factually, the way she might note that the weather had turned cold. "He leased the land to this Merritt person, took money from him for it, then turned around and used the same deed to convince me to marry him and come west." Hooper set down his papers and looked at her with something approaching genuine sympathy. "Mrs. Bristol, I am sorry. Where is Grant Merritt's ranch?" she asked. "Now, Mrs. Bristol, I'd suggest—" "I am not asking for your suggestions, Mr. Hooper. I am asking for directions." She found the ranch 3 miles east of town, at the end of a dirt road lined with young cottonwood trees that had just begun to turn the faint gold of early autumn. The house was modest but solidly built, a 2-room affair with a proper stone chimney and a covered porch running the full front length. There was a barn painted red, or it had been painted red at some point, and the Nevada sun had weathered it to a dusty rose, and a corral where 4 horses stood switching their tails in the afternoon heat. Smoke rose from the chimney. She hitched the rented horse to the post at the porch steps and knocked on the door. The man who opened it was not what she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the precise gray-green of sage after rain. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had a mug of coffee in his left hand, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected that has arrived on his doorstep at a difficult time. "Grant Merritt," she said. "That's me," he said. "My name is Maude Bristol. I believe we need to have a conversation about this land." He stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "I expect we do," he said. "Come in." The kitchen was clean in the way that a man's kitchen is clean when he is organized by temperament rather than instruction. Everything had a place and was in it. There was a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of tins and dry goods. A rifle hung above the door. A dog of indeterminate heritage was sleeping under the table and opened one eye at Maude before deciding she was not interesting enough to deserve further attention. Grant Merritt set his coffee mug on the table, pulled out a chair, and waited for her to sit down before he sat across from her. That single courtesy told her something about him that the clean kitchen had already started to suggest. She laid the deed on the table between them. He did not touch it. He looked at it for a long moment, and she watched something move through his expression: recognition, and then a controlled, careful anger that he kept from his voice when he spoke. "Edmund Bristol," he said. "My late husband," she said. "He died 6 weeks ago on the train west. Before that, he convinced me to marry him by showing me this deed and telling me this land was mine. I had no idea he had also leased it to you." She paused. "How long have you been here?" 22 months, Grant said. "Paid Bristol $300 for the lease up front, with an option to purchase at the end of 5 years. I built the barn, dug out the well, put in that corral." His jaw was tight. "He came through once 8 months ago, collected the first year's lease payment in cash. I have the receipt." "I do not doubt you," Maude said. He looked at her then sharply, as though he had been bracing for a fight and found her answer disarmed him. "Most people in your position would." "I have been lied to recently by the same man," she said. "I find I have little appetite for doubting the other people he deceived." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is it you want, Mrs. Bristol?" It was the right question, and she respected him for asking it plainly. "I want what is mine," she said. "But I am not sure what that is yet, legally speaking, because Edmund Bristol appears to have sold and leased the same piece of land simultaneously. The deed may be valid. Your lease may also be valid. It is possible that neither of us has a clean claim." "Or we both do," he said. "Or we both do," she agreed. He stood up and went to the stove and poured a second mug of coffee without asking whether she wanted one, which she found she did not mind because she wanted one badly and would not have asked. He set it in front of her. "There's a lawyer in Elko," he said. "Man named Carver. He's dealt with land disputes before. If we went together, presented both documents, let him sort it out." He stopped. He looked at her across the table, and she saw him working through something, some internal negotiation. "Where are you staying?" "I had not made arrangements," she said. His expression was carefully neutral. "There's a boarding house on Pine Street. Mrs. Orton runs it. It's decent." "Thank you," she said. She picked up the deed and put it back in her bag. She drank the coffee, which was good, strong, and not too bitter, and stood to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. He was still sitting at the table, both hands around his mug, watching her with that careful gray-green gaze. "I am sorry about your land, Mr. Merritt," she said. "Whatever we work out legally, I want you to know that I did not come here to take anything from you. Edmund Bristol did enough taking for the both of us." She left before he could answer, which was probably wise, because she was not entirely certain her composure would hold if she stayed another 5 minutes in that warm kitchen with its clean order and its sleeping dog, and the man who sat in it watching her, as though she were a problem he was genuinely interested in solving. She took a room at Mrs. Orton's boarding house, which was indeed decent, with a window that faced east toward the hills and a quilt on the bed that someone had made with real care. She sat on that bed in the late afternoon light and allowed herself 10 minutes of honest grief, for the marriage that had been a lie, for the future she had planned around it, for the particular loneliness of being a widow for a man she had only known 2 months, most of which she had spent being deceived. Then she folded the grief up and put it away, because she had never had the luxury of sitting inside her feelings for too long, and she began to think practically about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, began the following morning, when Grant Merritt arrived at Mrs. Orton's boarding house at 8 o'clock with his horse and one spare, and told her the road to Elko was better traveled early before the afternoon heat set in, and asked whether she was ready. She was ready. She had been up since 6. They rode the 40 miles to Elko mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who are each thinking hard and do not feel the need to fill the space with noise. Nevada in September was extraordinary in the morning, the light coming in at a low angle that turned every rock and scrub bush golden, the sky so wide and blue it felt almost aggressive. Maude had grown up in Cincinnati, where the horizon was always interrupted by a building or a tree, and she was not yet accustomed to this much sky. It kept startling her. "Where are you from?" Grant asked, somewhere around the halfway point when they had stopped to water the horses at a shallow creek. "Cincinnati," she said. "Before that, a small town in Ohio called Millfield that you have certainly never heard of. And before that," he was watching the horses drink, not looking at her. "A farm," she said. "My father's farm. He died when I was 19, left the farm to my brother, who had a wife and children and very little room for a sister with opinions." She paused. "I taught school for 5 years. Then Maude Bristol came through Cincinnati on what I now understand was a very deliberate tour of respectable unmarried women with enough sense to manage a property." "He picked you for your sense," Grant said, and it was not quite a question. "I believe so," she said. "I was not the prettiest woman he could have chosen, but I was organized and I was capable, and I suspect he knew that whoever he saddled with this situation would need to be both those things to survive it." Grant turned to look at her then, and there was something in his expression she could not quite name, not pity. She would have rejected pity immediately, but something quieter and more genuine than that. "He was right about that part," he said. She looked back at him steadily. "You don't know me." "No," he said. "But I can see the way you rode 40 miles on a borrowed horse to a lawyer's office without complaining once, and I can see that you haven't cried or screamed or blamed me for any of this, and I can see that what you want is a fair resolution and not a weapon. That's enough to go on for now." She turned back to the horses because she did not entirely trust her face in that moment. Lawyer Carver in Elko was a small man with a large desk and the particular weariness of someone who had spent many years watching the West dispossess people in creative and varied ways. He examined both documents for a long time, asked Grant and Maude each a series of precise questions, and then leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "The deed is valid," he said. "The lease is also valid. You are both right and you are both in a bind." He looked at them. "The cleanest resolution, legally speaking, would be a shared arrangement. Mrs. Bristol holds title as the deed specifies. Mr. Merritt continues to work the land under a lease arrangement restructured to exclude the fraudulent elements, with payments going to the actual deed holder rather than a dead fraud. At the end of the 5-year period Mr. Merritt originally contracted for, he retains the option to purchase." Maude and Grant looked at each other. "That means you would be my landlord," Grant said slowly. "Technically," Maude said. "Yes." "And you would live where?" "I have not decided," she said. Then, because she was not going to be dishonest about it, "I have almost no money, Mr. Merritt. What Edmund left, which was not much, he spent freely, went to his debts. I have enough to last perhaps 2 months at the boarding house. After that I would need either to find work or to find another arrangement." Grant was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The house has 2 rooms." Carver looked at the ceiling again with professional discretion. "I beg your pardon," Maude said. "It is not a suggestion," Grant said, and she could see him picking his words with real care. "It is a fact I am offering to you for consideration. The house has 2 rooms. I have used one. The other has been used for storage. You are the deed holder. It is your land and arguably your house." He paused. What I am saying is that there is a practical solution available here if you are willing to consider it that does not require you to spend money you don't have on a boarding house for 2 months while you figure out what comes next. Maude looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching. You would be comfortable with that arrangement, she said. A woman you met yesterday living in your house. It is your house, he said again. And I think he stopped, tried again. Mrs. Bristol, I have been working that land for 22 months. I have put everything I have into it. I need you to trust me enough to stay while we work this out, and I suspect you need a roof over your head that isn't costing you money you can't spare. I am not suggesting anything improper. I am suggesting that two people who have both been wronged by the same man might benefit from helping each other. It was the most he had said at one time since she met him. She had the sense it was more than he usually said. All right, she said. She saw the tension leave his shoulders just barely. All right, he said. She moved her carpetbag from Mrs. Orton's boarding house to the ranch on a Thursday. The second room, once Grant had moved the stored equipment to the barn, turned out to be a decent size with good light from the north window. He had found somewhere a rope bed and a mattress that smelled of cedar, and there was a chest of drawers that was plain but functional. He had left a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, and when she saw them, she stood very still for a moment because she could not tell whether they were decorative or accidental, whether he had put them there deliberately or simply not noticed them left over from some previous time. She did not ask. She put her carpetbag in the chest of drawers and hung her second dress on the peg behind the door, and decided that wildflowers in a window were good regardless of their origin. The first week was careful and polite in the way of two strangers negotiating shared space. They each cooked their own meals, or tried to, until the second evening when Maude made a pot of stew large enough for 4 people and Grant came in from the corral to find the smell of it filling the whole house and stood in the kitchen doorway looking slightly undone. That's for both of us, she said, not looking up from the pot. It does not make sense to cook separately when one pot serves perfectly well. I don't expect you to cook for me, he said. I am not cooking for you, she said. I am cooking efficiently. There is a difference, she looked up then. You can do the same tomorrow if you like. I understand you make reasonable coffee. Something moved through his expression that was almost a smile. I make excellent coffee, he said. I reserve judgment, she said, but she was fighting a smile herself. After that, they shared meals, and the kitchen became a place where the day was assessed and sorted at the end of it, where the horse's progress was discussed, and the condition of the pasture fence, and the behavior of the 2 milk cows Grant had acquired, and his plans for increasing the herd once he had the capital for it. Maude listened to all of it carefully and asked good questions, because she had grown up on a farm and understood cattle and land in a way that Edmund Bristol had presumably counted on when he chose her. And occasionally she made suggestions that Grant would sit with quietly for a moment and then incorporate into his thinking. She began to help with the work because she could not sit still while things needed doing and because the alternative was to spend her days with nothing but her own thoughts, which was not a comfortable arrangement. She was not a delicate woman. She knew how to mend a fence post, how to turn soil, how to treat a horse's leg when it swelled. Grant watched the first time she took down a section of corral rail that had rotted through and replaced it with a steady efficiency that asked for nothing, and he did not say anything about it then, but that evening at supper he said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she said. A city woman with a deed and a grievance and no idea what to do with 340 acres. "I have a grievance," she said, "but it is a private one." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She learned the land in those first weeks. She walked every acre of it on the days when the light was good and the air was cool enough for walking, learning the way the creek ran through the eastern pasture, learning where the ground went soft in wet years, and where it held firm, learning the specific way the afternoon light fell across the flat grazing section and turned it a color that she could not name but found herself thinking about when she was not looking at it. She was beginning to understand what Edmund Bristol had taken from her and what he had accidentally given her. He had taken the marriage she had thought she was getting. He had accidentally given her this land, this air, this specific quality of Nevada light, and though she was not ready to name it yet, a man who knocked gently on her bedroom door each morning to let her know the coffee was ready rather than calling through the wall, a small courtesy that she found herself waiting for. The town of Colton Creek had, as all small towns do, opinions about the arrangement. Mrs. Orton at the boarding house told anyone who would listen that Maude Bristol was a decent woman in a difficult situation, and people should mind their own affairs, which was helpful. A woman named Clara Finch, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, was less charitable and made comments about propriety that reached Maude's ears through the efficient telegraph of small-town gossip. Maude walked into the dry goods store on a Wednesday in October, bought flour and salt and a length of calico, and looked Clara Finch directly in the eye the whole time with such composed pleasantness that Clara eventually looked away first. "You are formidable," Grant said when she told him about it that evening with what she recognized as real admiration. "I am tired of other people's opinions of my circumstances," she said. "I did not do anything wrong. I came west. I ended up here. I am making the best of it." "You are," he said. And then, after a pause that had a different quality to it than his usual pauses, "I am glad you did." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm, and the dog, whose name she had learned was Bear, a name that suited him not at all since he was small and brown and extremely gentle, was asleep under the table with his chin on her foot. Outside, the Nevada wind was starting its evening conversation with the cottonwood trees. "I am too," she said quietly, "although I could not have told you that 3 weeks ago." "What would you have told me 3 weeks ago?" "That I was managing," she said, which was true, but it was not the same thing. He looked at her steadily. There was something in his eyes that she had been noticing more and more, something that was not the practical evaluation of a man assessing a useful neighbor, but something warmer and less measured than that, something he was keeping careful control of, which she understood because she was keeping careful control of the same thing on her side of the table. "There's a harvest social at the church this Saturday," he said. "I was going to skip it, but if you wanted to go as a way of establishing yourself in town, meeting people, I would be glad to take you." It was a careful offer, framed practically, which was characteristic of him. "I would like that," she said, which was the careful acceptance it deserved. The social was held in the church hall, which had been decorated with dried corn husks and late-season flowers, and half of Colton Creek had turned out for it. There was a fiddle player and a man who played the mouth organ, and someone had contributed several pies of varying quality and a great quantity of cider. Maude stood at the edge of the room in her better dress, the dark blue one with the small white collar, and let Grant introduce her to people, watching how they received her. Most of them were generous. The West was, she was coming to understand, a place where people who had arrived under difficult circumstances were more common than people who had arrived otherwise, and there was a generosity of spirit that came from that shared understanding. A rancher named Tom Bledsoe pumped her hand and said he hoped she intended to stay because the territory needed more people with backbone. A woman named Ruth Calhoun, who had come west from Virginia 10 years prior with her husband and 3 small children after the war had taken everything they owned, told Maude that the first year was the hardest and the second year was still hard, but by the third year you stopped thinking about where you had come from and started thinking about where you were going. "Is that true?" Maude asked her genuinely. "Lord, yes," Ruth said. "By the third year this land gets into you, right down into your bones. You stop belonging to where you were born, and you start belonging to where you live." She looked at Grant, who was across the room talking to Tom Bledsoe and unconsciously tracking Maude's location the way a man does when he is trying not to appear to be tracking someone's location. "That man has been out here 4 years," Ruth said. "He belongs to it completely. Give yourself time." Maude looked at Grant across the room. He felt her looking and glanced over, and their eyes met for a moment before he turned back to his conversation with the faintest color along his jaw that she was almost certain was not from the warmth of the room. "He is a good man," Ruth said, with the satisfied certainty of someone who has been watching a situation develop from a distance and knows exactly where it is going. "He is," Maude said, perhaps more simply than she had intended. They danced twice because the fiddle player made it difficult not to, and Grant held her correctly at the proper distance with his hand firm at her back and his other hand holding hers carefully, like something he was aware of. He was a decent dancer, better than she had expected for a man who clearly did not go to socials often, and she said so. "My mother taught me," he said. She believed that a man who could not dance was only half civilized. "Where is your mother?" Maude asked. "Missouri," he said. "She's well, I write her when I can." A pause. "She writes back and asks when I am going to do something about being alone." Maude looked up at him. "What do you tell her?" "I tell her I am working on it," he said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself, as though the words had arrived before he had fully examined them. She did not say anything. The fiddle was playing something slow, and the room was full of warm light and conversation, and the smell of cider and dried flowers, and she was aware of nothing so much as the careful, deliberate way Grant Merritt was holding her aware of every inch of distance he was maintaining. And why? And she thought that the reason he was maintaining it was not that he did not want to close it. October passed into November, and the days grew shorter and the mornings colder, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms. Grant's cattle, a modest herd of 43 head, were brought in closer to the home pasture. The garden Maude had started in a plot behind the house, late in the season, but she had managed some winter vegetables, was put to bed under straw mulch against the cold. The evenings came earlier, and they sat longer at the kitchen table after supper, talking, reading on occasion from the small collection of books on the shelf by the door, sometimes just sitting in the comfortable silence that was becoming the best kind of evidence that two people fit together. She learned him the way you learn a piece of land gradually, not all at once, each new aspect revealing something of the whole. He had grown up in Missouri, one of 3 brothers on a farm, the middle one. He had come west at 25 after a series of events he was not specific about, but that she gathered involved a land dispute, different from this one, older, that had cost his family their farm, and sent the 3 brothers in 3 different directions. The older brother had gone to California. The younger was in Texas. Grant had come to Nevada with $200, a horse, and the specific intention of owning his own land before he turned 30. "You are 30 now," she said one evening. "Yes," he said. "And you own the land," she said, "or you will." "We own it," he said quietly. "At the moment, technically, you do." "I have been thinking about that," she said. She had been thinking about it for some time, in fact, and had been waiting for the right moment. "Lawyer Carver said the arrangement we have is legally sound, but it is not a real partnership. You have done the work here. You built this place. I came in on a fraudulent deed." "The deed is valid," he said immediately. "I know, but that is not the same as deserved." She looked at him. "I would like to have the arrangement formally revised. The land should be in both our names with equal standing. Not landlord and tenant, partners." Grant was very still. "That is a generous offer." "It is not generosity," she said. "It is accuracy." She paused. "You have given me a great deal. A place to live, a fair arrangement, she chose the word carefully, your steadiness. I want to give back something real." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp was burning low and the wind was at the windows and Bear was dreaming something that made his paws twitch gently against the floorboards, and the whole room felt very close and very warm. "There is a simpler arrangement," Grant said slowly. "That would make us equal partners in everything." Her breath came a little differently. "Is there?" "You know there is," he said, and his voice was lower than it usually was, careful in a new way. "Maude." He had been calling her Maude for 3 weeks, the formal Mrs. Bristol having worn away naturally somewhere in the course of fence mending and shared meals. "I did not plan on saying this yet. I was going to wait longer, give you more time to settle, not crowd you." He stopped, started again. "You came here carrying his name, a dead man's name, and I have watched you these 2 months carry it with more dignity than it deserved, and I have thought often that—" He met her eyes across the table. "I would like very much to offer you a different one, if you wanted it." Mine. The silence in the room was complete and warm. "Are you asking me to marry you, Grant Merritt?" she said. "I am," he said. "I am doing it badly, but I am." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Edmund Bristol and the lies that had brought her here, and she thought about Ruth Calhoun saying that by the 3rd year the land gets into your bones, and you stop belonging to where you were born. And she thought about the wildflowers on the windowsill that first day that she had never asked about and he had never explained. And she thought about the way he had said her name just now, the particular quality of it, the weight of the care he had put into that one word. "I did not come west expecting to find something real," she said. "I came west expecting to manage, to survive a difficult situation and make the best of it." She folded her hands on the table. "I have found, somewhat to my surprise, that I have found something real." "Is that a yes?" he said. And despite everything, despite the care and the gravity of the moment, there was something in his expression that was almost boyish with hope. "Yes," she said, "that is a yes." He crossed the table to her in 2 steps. Later she would think it was the most decisive she had ever seen him move, which was saying something for a man who was generally decisive. And when he took her face in his hands and kissed her, it was not tentative in the least. It was a kiss that had been waiting patiently since approximately the 3rd morning of the coffee knocking on the door routine, and it knew its own mind completely. Bear woke up, looked at them, and went back to sleep. They were married in December, 3 days before Christmas, in the Colton Creek church, with Tom Bledsoe standing up for Grant and Ruth Calhoun standing up for Maude, and approximately 40 townspeople in attendance because the news had spread and people were, on the whole, pleased about it. The preacher was a man named Aldrich, who did a clean and genuine ceremony, without excess ornamentation. When he asked Maude whether she took Grant Merritt as her husband, she said yes with the particular clarity of someone who has made one decision in their life under false pretenses and is making this one with their whole mind and heart open. When Aldrich said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," Ruth Calhoun cried, which she had told everyone she absolutely would not do. After, in the churchyard in the cold December light with snow on the distant mountains and the smell of pine and cold air coming down off the hills, Grant took Maude's hand and looked at her, and she could see everything in his face that he usually kept careful and quiet, and it was considerable. "You could have kept the other name," he said. "Bristol, you didn't have to take mine." "I know," she said. "That was rather the point, the choice of it." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture both formal and deeply felt. "Maude Merritt," he said, trying it. "That is my name," she said. They rode home in the wagon together under a sky that was starting to cloud over with the promise of the season's first real snow. And Grant put his arm around her against the cold, and she leaned into his side. And the horse knew the way home well enough to need no particular direction, which was fortunate because neither of them was paying close attention to the road. Winter settled in over the ranch with a firm hand. The snow came in January and covered the pastures in white and made the mornings extraordinary, the light off the snow so bright it required squinting. Maude discovered that she loved the snow in a way she had not in Cincinnati, where snow was an inconvenience, because here it was simply part of the land's language, another season in the long conversation between the ground and the sky. They worked the ranch together through the winter, and she learned that working alongside Grant Merritt was one of the more satisfying experiences she had ever had in her life, because he was a man who thought before he acted and acted without hesitation once he had thought, and he had a particular way of solving problems that involved looking at them from multiple angles before arriving at the simplest possible solution, which was a quality she had always valued and rarely found. He was also, and this she had known since approximately the Harvest social, genuinely funny, in a dry, observational way that he deployed rarely enough that it always caught her off guard, which she suspected was deliberate. "You are wasted on cattle," she told him once, when he had made her laugh hard enough that she had to set down the water bucket she was carrying. "Cattle appreciate me," he said seriously. "They just don't show it." She learned, too, the history of him, the parts he had not volunteered early on. The family farm in Missouri, and how it had been lost, a predatory lender, and a local judge who had been in the lender's pocket. A story that was common enough in those years that its familiarity made it no less bitter. He had worked for 2 years on other men's ranches, saving every cent before he had enough to come west and start over. He had chosen Nevada specifically because the land was available, the water was manageable if you were careful, and it was far enough from his past to feel genuinely new. "Do you miss Missouri?" she asked. "Parts of it," he said. "My mother, my brothers, though I write to them. The way the land looks in June when the corn is up." He paused. "But missing something doesn't mean wanting it back. I am where I want to be." He said it simply, without emphasis, and she knew without him elaborating that he meant more than the land. She wrote to her brother in Ohio in February, a letter that was more honest than the one she had written in October, which had been brief and managed. She told him about Edmund's death and the fraud and the land and Grant. She told him about the wedding. She was not sure what response she expected. Her brother Thomas was a decent man but not an imaginative one, and he had always found Maude somewhat larger than he was comfortable managing. But the letter he sent back was kind. He was glad she was settled. He was glad the man seemed decent. He hoped the ranch would do well. His wife Margaret sent her regards and a recipe for apple cake that she said traveled well enough to be made anywhere. Maude made the apple cake in February and Grant ate 2 pieces and said it was the best thing that had come from Ohio since she had. "That is extremely sentimental for you," she said. "It's the apple cake talking," he said. "Don't repeat it." Spring came the way Nevada springs come, sudden and unapologetic. The snow going in a matter of weeks, and the land coming back in waves of green that moved up from the valley floor toward the hills like a slow fire. The creek in the eastern pasture ran high with snowmelt, and Grant spent 2 weeks reinforcing the bank on the near side to prevent flooding of the lower pasture. And Maude worked alongside him. And the wet cold of it and the smell of the creek and the mud and the new grass were so specific and so good that she found herself stopping sometimes just to take them in. Standing in the middle of the eastern pasture with her boots muddy and her hair escaping its pins, and feeling something she recognized. After a moment's thought, as exactly what Ruth Calhoun had described, the land getting into her bones. The cattle had wintered well. Grant began planning the expansion of the herd. He rode to Elko in April to discuss financing with the bank there. Lawyer Carver had been helpful in sorting their combined claim into a clear legal document listing both Grant and Maude Merritt as joint title holders, which gave them the collateral to negotiate, and came back with a line of credit and a list of cattle to view at a sale in Elko the following month. Maude went to the sale with him, which surprised the cattle men there, most of whom had not brought their wives and were not entirely sure what to do with a woman who walked through the pens with the calm efficiency of someone who knew what she was looking at. She knew what she was looking at. She pointed out a problem with the hips on a heifer that the seller was presenting as a premium animal, and the rancher beside Grant said under his breath, "Your wife just saved you $50, and Grant said with quiet pleasure, "She usually does." They bought 18 head that day, bringing the herd to 61, which was what Grant had initially set as his target for year 3 of the operation. He was 2 months ahead of schedule. On the ride home from Elko, with the cattle being driven by 2 hired hands behind them, Grant said, "I want to talk to you about the house." "What about it?" she said. "I want to add to it," he said. "Another room, maybe 2. The kitchen could stand to be bigger." And he paused. "There may be reason for more space." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with studied casualness. "Grant," she said. "Yes, still casual, almost convincingly casual. Are you asking what I think you are asking?" He glanced at her then, and the studied casualness dropped completely, and what was there instead was something unguarded and warm and a little bit hopeful in a way that made her feel the full weight of how much she had come to love this man. "If you want to," he said. "I do not want to push you before you are ready. We have only been married 4 months." "5," she said. "And a half." 5 and a half, he agreed. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on his knee and held it, which was not something she did often on horseback but which the occasion seemed to require. "I want to," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers back. They rode the rest of the way home with the cattle lowing behind them and the spring light making everything gold. And Maude thought about her mother's kitchen in Millfield, Ohio, where there had been a window over the sink that looked out at an apple tree, and about the way the morning light had come through it, and about how she had not thought about that kitchen in years, and was thinking about it now because she was thinking about building something that would be her children's memory of home. That spring and summer were the happiest she had been. This was not a dramatic happiness. It was not the happiness of great events but of accumulated good ones. The cattle doing well. The garden coming in abundantly. The house expansion, which Grant undertook with Tom Bledsoe's help and a carpenter from town named Asaph Purcell, who added 2 rooms to the east side of the house, a proper bedroom for Grant and Maude to replace the converted storage room that had been their first winter arrangement, and a second room that they did not formally designate but both understood the purpose of. In June, Maude told Grant she was expecting. He sat with it for a moment, very still, and then he looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before, something that was past joy and into something quieter and more absolute, something that had no name she knew. "When?" He said, "January," she said, "or February, I think Mrs. Calhoun says February. You told Ruth before me." He said it without accusation, only amused surprise. "I needed to confirm it with someone who had done it before," she said. "She has 3 children. I thought she was a reasonable authority." "She is," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Maude, do not become sentimental," she said, but she was holding his hand back with both of hers. "I will become sentimental if I want to," he said. "It is my prerogative." She laughed, which she did often now, and he watched her laugh with the specific attention of someone who finds a thing beautiful and knows it. The summer brought other things besides joy, because no year is only one thing. In July, a man came to the ranch asking about the land, a rough man named Colter who claimed to have been in business with Maude Bristol, and said he was owed money that he proposed to collect in the form of a claim on the property. He was not dangerous exactly, but he was loud and unpleasant, and he arrived when Grant was out in the far pasture, which meant Maude opened the door to him alone. She listened to his claim, which was incoherent and largely bluster, and then she told him with perfect clarity that she was the joint deed holder of the property in question, that her title had been verified and filed in Elko by a licensed attorney, and that if he had a legitimate claim against Maude Bristol's estate he was welcome to pursue it through the Elko probate court, but that it had nothing to do with her or her husband or this land. She gave him Lawyer Carver's name and address. She did not raise her voice once. He left, grumbling, and was not seen again. When Grant came in from the pasture that evening she told him about it. He listened with a tightening jaw, and she could see him working out whether he should have been there. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I'm not questioning that, He stopped. "You wanted to be here," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She moved around the table to him, which she did not do often in the kitchen because the kitchen was where they were practical, and put her hand on his face, and he turned into her palm like Bear turned into a friendly hand, immediate and certain. "You cannot always be everywhere at once," she said, "and I am not a woman who needs rescuing, Grant, you know that." "I know," he said. "I still want to be here." "You are here," she said. "More than anywhere else you are here." He put his arms around her and held her in the kitchen in the summer evening light, and that was the full resolution of it, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the kind of silence that is fuller than most conversation. Autumn came again, Maude's second Nevada autumn, and she was large with the baby and did less physical work but found other ways to be useful. The books for the ranch, which she had taken over in spring and which were now impeccably kept. The correspondence with the Elko Bank and with buyers Grant was developing for the following year's cattle sales. The management of the household with a completeness that freed Grant to focus entirely on the operation. She had found her competence a place here, a real place, one that was genuinely needed and genuinely valued. She walked the land every day that the weather permitted, the eastern pasture and the creek and the flat grazing section, often with Bear waddling alongside her at a pace that accommodated her current speed. The cottonwoods along the road were golden again, and the mornings were cold and brilliant. She stood sometimes in the field and looked at the mountains and thought about Cincinnati and the small world she had come from, the small life that had been waiting for her there if she had not stepped onto that train with Maude Bristol, and she felt something she could only call gratitude. Not for Edmund. She was not capable of gratitude for Edmund, but for the strange chain of events that had deposited her here, in this specific landscape, with this specific man. Grant found her there one afternoon in October, standing in the east pasture with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned toward the mountains. "You do this a lot," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Look at the mountains. Stand and think at the mountains," he said. "I can always tell when you are doing it because you get a particular expression." "What expression?" "The one that means you are deciding something," she smiled. "I am not deciding anything, I am simply being here. It took me a while to understand how to do that, just be somewhere without planning what comes next." "The land does that to you," he said. "Eventually. Ruth told me she was right." Maude looked at the mountains for another moment. "Grant, yes. I want to tell you something that I have not told you properly." He turned to look at her, waiting, with the full attention he always gave her. "When I came here," she said, "I was carrying a name that was not mine in any meaningful sense. It was a dead man's name, and he had given it to me under false pretenses, and it was the only thing I had. And you," she paused, "you gave me somewhere to put it down. You gave me something real to pick up instead. Not just your name, though I love your name, all of it. The land and the work and the—" She turned to him. "The you of it, the specific fact of you." Grant was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass. "Maude," he said, and his voice had that quality it sometimes had when he was past his usual careful composure. "You did not need me to give you any of that. It was always in you." "Perhaps," she said, "but I needed somewhere to put it. I needed the ground under me to be real." She met his eyes. "You are the realest thing I have ever known." He stepped forward and put his arms around her, carefully, the way he had learned to hold her these past weeks, with the baby between them demanding its accommodation, and she leaned her forehead against his chest and felt the solid reality of him and the land beneath her feet and the cold mountain air and the specific quality of the light in that place at that hour of that afternoon, and she thought, "This is the life. This is the actual life." The baby arrived in the first week of February 1880, on a night when the temperature had dropped sharply, and Grant had kept the fires in both stoves burning through the night. Ruth Calhoun came to assist, as she had offered to do, and sent her husband home with instructions to be useful somewhere else. The birth was long but not complicated, and at 3 in the morning a boy arrived, small and red and furious at the entire situation. Grant, who had been on the other side of the door for 7 hours in a state of barely managed distress, was allowed in once Ruth had signaled it was time. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in Maude's arms, and Maude watched his face go through something that had no adequate description. Wonder, she supposed, was the word, though it was a thin word for the full weight of what she saw. "He's so small," Grant said very quietly. "He will not stay that way," Ruth said from the doorway, with the authority of someone who had done this 3 times. Grant reached out very carefully and touched the baby's hand, one finger, and the baby, with the uncanny purposefulness of the newly born, wrapped his hand around Grant's finger and held on. Grant looked up at Maude, and she had not seen his eyes like that before, had not known until that moment what more there was to see in them, and she thought that she could spend the rest of her life discovering new things in this man's face and not be done by the end of it. "What shall we call him?" she said. "I had been thinking," Grant said, still looking at the baby, "about Thomas, if you wanted that for your brother." She had not expected that. Thomas, who had written kindly. Thomas, who had sent the apple cake recipe. Thomas, who had given her to understand in that careful letter that he was glad she had found something real. "Thomas Merritt," she said. "Thomas Grant Merritt," Grant said. "If that's all right." "That is perfect," she said. Thomas Grant Merritt made himself known over the following weeks as a person of strong opinions and considerable lung capacity. He ate well and grew quickly, and was the source of profound sleep deprivation for both his parents, who managed it by trading off with the equitable practicality that characterized their partnership in everything. Grant was remarkable with the baby in the early weeks, steady and patient in the way he was with most things that required steadiness and patience, which was, Maude reflected, essentially everything. Mrs. Orton from the boarding house brought a gift. The Bledsoes brought a gift. Clara Finch from the dry goods store, whose opinion of Maude had undergone a gradual revision over the preceding year, brought a hand-embroidered blanket and offered congratulations with a warmth that was genuine. The ranch was doing well. By spring of 1880, the herd had grown to 78 head, and Grant had begun discussing with Tom Bledsoe the possibility of joining forces for a cattle drive north, where the prices were better and the market was expanding. Maude ran the accounting through the spring with Thomas on her hip or asleep in the cradle beside the desk, and she brought the books to the conversation with Grant and Tom with the same clarity she brought to everything. Tom looked at the accounting ledger and then at Maude and then at Grant. "You married up," he said to Grant. "I know it," Grant said, without a trace of self-consciousness. The cattle drive north happened in late spring, with Grant riding out for 3 weeks, which was the longest they had been apart since she had arrived in Colton Creek, and she found the ranch without him very large and very quiet in a way that was uncomfortable, not because she could not manage. She could manage perfectly well, and did, but because she had become accustomed to the specific gravity of his presence, the way the house oriented itself around him when he was in it. He wrote her 2 letters from the trail, short and practical, and with 1 paragraph each that was neither short nor practical, but was the full, honest expression of a man who did not usually speak at length about what he felt. And she read those paragraphs several times and kept the letters in the chest of drawers beside her careful things. He came back on a Tuesday afternoon with a fair price for the cattle and a length of blue ribbon he had bought in the northern town, because it was the color of the dress she had worn to the harvest social the year before, and he had thought of her when he saw it. He presented it to her on the porch, somewhat embarrassed by the presentation, and she took it and looked at it and then looked at him, dusty and trail-worn on the porch steps with Thomas on his hip because he had picked the boy up first thing, and she thought she had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. "You are a sentimental man," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he said. She put her arms around him and Thomas both, and Thomas grabbed a handful of her hair with typical enthusiasm, and Grant laughed, and the 3 of them stood on the porch in the late afternoon sun, and it was exactly and entirely enough. That summer she began to write again, which she had not done since she was a girl in Ohio. Not letters, she wrote plenty of letters, but other things, observations of the land and the seasons, descriptions of the light in the east pasture, and the sound the creek made under ice in winter, and the particular blue of the Nevada sky at noon in August. She did not tell Grant about it at first because she was not sure it was anything, but he found her at the table one evening with the journal and a look on her face that was entirely focused and private, and he sat down quietly and did not interrupt until she was done. When she closed the journal and looked up, he was just watching her. "Nothing," she said, "only notes. "Your face when you do it," he said, "looks the same as your face when you walk the east pasture, like something that belongs to you." She looked at the journal in her hands. "I used to write when I was young. My father thought it was a waste of time for a girl." "Your father was wrong," Grant said flatly. She smiled. "Many people were wrong about many things. It is beginning to seem like the normal condition of the world." "Keep writing," he said. "Whatever it is, keep it." She kept it. She wrote through the late summer and the following autumn and winter, and what accumulated in those pages was the record of a life being built, a detailed and particular account of one woman's experience of a specific piece of land and a specific series of years, and the specific man she was building it all with. She did not think of it as anything but her own, but it was, in fact, a beautiful record. In the spring of 1881, she told Grant she was expecting again. This time he heard it without the long stillness. He looked at her across the breakfast table with Thomas eating something enthusiastically and noisily in the chair beside him, and he said, "When?" "October, I think," she said. He reached across Thomas's breakfast chaos and took her hand. Thomas, who had recently become verbal on most subjects, said, "Papa," and tried to climb Grant's arm, which was his current method of demanding attention. Grant picked Thomas up with one arm and kept hold of Maude's hand with the other, and looked from the boy to the woman with an expression she recognized as his version of complete contentment. The letter from his brother arrived that summer, the older one, Henry, who had been in California. He had married and had 2 children and was doing well enough in the fruit orchards outside Sacramento, and he wrote to say that their younger brother James in Texas was also married now and had written to both of them. The family, dispersed and scattered by loss and distance, was nonetheless persisting, putting down new roots in new ground, and Grant read the letter sitting on the porch steps in the evening and then sat quietly with it for a while. "Good news?" Maude asked from beside him. "Yes," he said. "Henry is well, James is married." He folded the letter carefully. "My mother will be glad. She spent a lot of years worrying about us." "All 3 of you far away," Maude said. "Yes." He was quiet. "I want to take you there someday to meet her." "I would like that," Maude said. "She will love you," he said, "not least because you are the first person I have ever encountered who can beat me in an argument by use of pure logic." "I do not argue with you," she said mildly. "You simply state your position until the superior logic of it becomes unavoidable," he said, "which amounts to the same thing." She laughed. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and the evening settled around them in the way Nevada evenings did, soft and vast and quiet, with the first stars coming out over the eastern hills. The second baby came in October as she had expected. A girl this time, smaller than Thomas had been but louder, with a set of lungs that impressed even Ruth Calhoun, who had thought she was beyond being impressed by babies after 20 years of attending births in the territory. They called her Eleanor, for Grant's mother, and she had dark hair and gray-green eyes, her father's eyes exactly, and Thomas was fascinated by her in the way of a 2-year-old who is not entirely sure whether a baby is a person or a particularly interesting kind of animal. Grant sat with Eleanor in the rocking chair on the first morning and talked to her quietly about the ranch, the cattle, the east pasture, the way the creek ran in spring, the name and disposition of every horse in the corral, with the full serious attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And Maude watched from the bed with her chin on her hand and thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Colton Creek 2 years ago carrying nothing but a dead man's name and a derringer in her boot, and who had been met, not by the hostile or the indifferent world she had braced for, but by this, by Grant Merritt in a clean kitchen with good coffee and careful hands, by this land that had gotten into her bones, by this life that was fully, irrevocably, magnificently hers. The years that followed built themselves one upon another with the solid good structure of things done right. The ranch grew to 120 head by 1883, and Grant brought on 2 permanent hands, a man named Alvara who had come up from New Mexico and whose horsemanship was outstanding, and a young man from town named Cecil who had come to Grant looking for work, with the directness of someone who had very little to lose and gained from it, a steady employer and a purpose. Grant paid them fairly, which was not universal in that country, and which was something Maude had something to do with, having made clear in the early days of their management discussions that fairness was not optional but practical. Men who were treated well worked well and stayed, which was cheaper in the long run than cycling through dissatisfied labor. There were harder years, as there were for everyone in the territory. A drought in the summer of 1882 that required Grant and Maude to make difficult decisions about the herd, selling some animals they would have preferred to keep in order to reduce pressure on the diminished water supply. A harsh winter in 1884 that cost them 8 cattle and required them to borrow against the following year's anticipated sale, which they managed carefully and repaid in full. These were not disasters. They were the ordinary difficulties of the life they had chosen, and they moved through them with the combined practical intelligence of two people who understood both the land and the numbers, and who faced each difficulty as partners rather than opponents. Thomas started school in 1885, which required negotiation with the single-room schoolhouse in Colton Creek, a building that served 23 children of varying ages, and was taught by a young woman from Illinois named Miss Pemberton, who was earnest and capable and slightly overwhelmed. Maude offered to help with the older students on Thursday afternoons, which Miss Pemberton accepted with visible relief, and so Maude found herself teaching again for the first time since Cincinnati, and she discovered that she had missed it. Thomas was a good student, serious and careful with his father's thoroughness. Eleanor, who started school 2 years later, was more like her mother, quick and argumentative, and already forming strong opinions on every subject at age 5, which Miss Pemberton found both challenging and secretly delightful. In the evenings when the children were in bed, Grant and Maude sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen was bigger now, the addition Asa Purcell had put on in the first year having made it genuinely comfortable, and talked about the same things they had always talked about: the land, the cattle, the seasons, the people of the town, the letters from Missouri and California and Texas. They talked about Thomas's reading and Eleanor's arithmetic, and whether the new section of fence on the south boundary was going to hold another winter. And they talked about the other things, the deeper things, the way they had always done, with the same openness that had characterized their kitchen table from the beginning. They talked about the land dispute that had shaped Grant's early life and the way he had rebuilt from it. They talked about the injustice of the lender and the corrupt judge who had taken his family's farm, about the way the territories had been places where men with money and connections could still move the law to suit themselves, and about how much depended on whether a person arrived with resources or without them. They talked about the men and women who had not been as fortunate, who had come west with less and found it harder, who were still at the mercy of systems that were supposed to be fair and frequently were not. Maude wrote about these things in her journal too, alongside the descriptions of the light and the land, and she had, by 1885, several volumes of the journal that sat on the shelf above the desk, in the office that had been the spare room before it was an office. And sometimes she opened one of the early volumes and read about the woman who had arrived in Colton Creek with a carpetbag and a dead man's name, and she felt toward that woman a tenderness that was distinct from self-pity. That was more like recognition, like looking at someone you were glad had survived something and arrived somewhere real. Grant read the journals once with her permission, sitting in the office on a winter afternoon while she was in the kitchen, and came out afterward and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her without speaking for a long moment. "You should let people read these," he said. "They are private," she said. "They are good," he said simply. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. "Maybe someday," she said. "I will not push it," he said, "but I mean it." Ruth Calhoun said the same thing when Maude showed her an entry once, 2 years later, on a Sunday when the children were playing in the yard, and the afternoon was long and warm. Ruth read it slowly, the way she did everything, and handed it back and said, "This is the kind of thing that needs to exist, for other women who come west not knowing what they will find." "You think so?" "I know so," Ruth said. "I wish I had had something like this when I arrived, something that said, 'It is hard and it is real and you will find your way into it and it will become yours.'" Maude looked at the pages in her hand. Then she looked at the yard where Thomas, 8 years old and already long-legged like his father, was explaining something to Eleanor with the patient intensity of an older sibling instructing a younger one. Eleanor was listening with the expression she always wore when she was simultaneously paying attention and forming a counter-argument. "I will think about it," Maude said. She did think about it. She thought about it for another year, and by the summer of 1887, she had organized the journals into a shape that could be read from beginning to end, and she had written to a woman in San Francisco who ran a small publishing concern that had put out several accounts of Western life, and the woman had written back with interest. It would take another year of correspondence and revision, but eventually in 1889 a slim book appeared, an account of one woman's arrival in the Nevada Territory and the building of a life there, published under the name M. Merritt. Grant held the finished book in his hands at the kitchen table in the evening of the day it arrived. "It has our name on it," he said. "Our name," she agreed. "I thought about using Bristol, but Bristol was a lie. Merritt is true." He looked at her with the full openness that she had come to know in him, that only appeared in these moments, at this table in this kitchen. "It is completely true," he said. Thomas, who was by then old enough to read the book in 2 days and came to his mother with the particular expression of a child who has learned something about their parent that makes the parent both more known and more astonishing. "You were very brave," he said. "I was very stubborn," she said. "Sometimes they look the same." He thought about this seriously, in the way he thought about most things, and then he said, "I think brave is when you do the thing even though it is hard. Is that right?" "That is exactly right," she said. "Then you were both," he said. Eleanor, reading it a week later, had a different response. She came in from the office where she had been reading and said, "Mama, when Mr. Coulter came to the door and you told him to go to the lawyer, did you have the derringer?" "I had it in my pocket," Maude said. Eleanor's eyes lit with tremendous satisfaction. "I knew it," she said. Grant, from across the kitchen, said nothing, but his shoulders were shaking. The summer of 1889 was a good summer. The cattle herd had stabilized at a profitable size, the operation running with the efficiency that came from over a decade of careful management. Alvaro was now the foreman in everything but name, and young Cecil had married a woman from town and built a small house on the property's south edge, part of an arrangement Grant had offered him in lieu of a portion of salary, which had worked well for both of them. The ranch was an established thing, known in the territory, respected. On a Sunday in August, Maude and Grant walked the east pasture in the early morning, before the heat came in and before the children were fully awake. This was something they did occasionally, an old habit going back to the first autumn, when she had begun to learn the land. They walked without speaking much, the way they had always been comfortable, side by side with the creek running alongside them and the cottonwoods big now, over a decade of growth, casting real shade. "I have been thinking," Grant said. "About what?" she said. "About the fact that it has been 11 years, he said, "since you knocked on that door. 11 years, she said, "since you made me decent coffee and held the door open. I should tell you," he said, "that the wildflowers on the windowsill were deliberate." She stopped walking. "I beg your pardon." He had the particular expression of a man delivering information he had been sitting on for some time. "The first day, when you moved in, the dried wildflowers in the window of your room, I put them there on purpose." "Grant Merritt," she said, "I wanted you to feel—" He paused. "Welcome," he said, like the room had been thought about, like someone had cared enough to put something there. He looked at her sideways. "I was not supposed to be falling in love with you at that point. It was 2 days in." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek ran beside them, and the cottonwoods moved in the first suggestion of a breeze, and the sky overhead was the blue that she had long since accepted was the particular color of her life, the color of this specific country that had become her country. "You absolute fraud," she said with tremendous affection. He laughed, the full real laugh that she had been drawing out of him for 11 years, the one that transformed his whole face. She took his arm and they walked on into the light of the east pasture, with the creek singing alongside them and the cattle moving in the far distance and the house visible through the cottonwoods behind them. Smoke just beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney where Thomas was, she knew, making his first serious attempt at coffee, which he had announced at breakfast 2 days ago was a skill he intended to acquire. "He is going to burn the pot," Grant said. "Probably," she said. "It will not be the end of the world." "No," he agreed. "It will not." Ahead of them, the east pasture opened up into the full morning, golden and enormous, the mountains blue at the far edge, the land rolling away in every direction under the great sky. Maude stood in it and felt it under her feet, felt the 11 years of it, the specific weight of the life she had built here, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage carrying a dead man's name and nothing else, and she thought, look what she found. "Grant," she said. "Maude," he said, with the particular tone he had been using her name with for 11 years, the one that was its own whole language. She turned to him in the morning light and put her hand on his chest, flat over his heart, a gesture so familiar to them both that it required no explanation. "I love you," she said. Not because she had not said it before, she said it regularly, as did he without ceremony, but because this morning in this light it felt important to say it plainly and completely, to say it with the full weight of what it meant, which was, "This land, this life, these children, this specific man, this is the thing I was moving toward without knowing it. This is what came from the worst thing that happened to me. This is what all of it was for." He put his hand over hers, warm and sure. "I love you," he said. "Every day, more than the day before." She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the east pasture of the Merritt ranch, their land, under the Nevada sky on a Sunday in August in 1889, and the creek sang beside them, and somewhere behind them through the cottonwoods a pot was probably burning, and a leaner was probably already up and already arguing with it, and the horses were moving in the corral, and the cattle were in the far pasture. And the cottonwoods were big and full and gold at their edges with the first suggestion of the coming season, and everything was true, and everything was theirs, and it was entirely, permanently, perfectly enough. Inside the house, Thomas carried 2 somewhat uneven mugs of coffee to the kitchen table, one for his father when he came in and one for his mother, set them down with careful precision, and looked at them with the satisfaction of a job done adequately if not yet expertly. Alina appeared in the doorway and looked at the coffee and then at her brother. "It smells burned," she said. "It is not burned," he said. "It smells burned," she said again with the magnificent certainty of a 9-year-old who has been right before. Thomas looked at the coffee. He looked at his sister. He looked at the coffee again. "Papa will say it is fine," he said. "Papa will say it is fine because Papa is kind," Alina said. "Mama will say if it is actually fine." Thomas considered this with genuine seriousness because it was, in fact, true. Through the kitchen window, they could see their parents coming back across the east pasture through the cottonwoods in the morning light, walking close together the way they always did, their heads bent toward each other, talking or not talking. It was hard to tell from this distance, and it did not matter, because either way they were in it together, the way they always were, the way they had always been, coming home. Bear, who was old now and gray around the muzzle and moved slowly, raised his head from his spot under the table and thumped his tail once against the floorboard, and Thomas looked at him and scratched his ears and said, "They are coming." Bear thumped his tail again. Alina went to the window and watched her parents come through the gap in the cottonwoods and start up the road toward the porch, and she watched the way they moved together, the way her father said something that made her mother turn and smile, The way her mother took his arm in the easy, natural way of people who have been walking beside each other for a long time. And she did not have words for what she was seeing because she was 9 years old, but she understood it was something. Something real and large and worth understanding. She would understand it better later when she was grown, when she read her mother's journals and the book that had come from them, and understood the whole story, the stage, the dead man's name, the deed, the kitchen, the coffee, the wildflowers. She would understand it as the story of two people who had each been stripped of something essential by a dishonest world and who had built, out of that loss, something so solid and so true that it held through everything. But that was later. This was now, and now was enough. The kitchen full of the smell of slightly burned coffee, and the sound of Bear's tail on the floor and the door opening and her father's voice and her mother's, and the ordinary particular music of a morning on the ranch that was theirs. The coffee burned, Maude said, coming through the door and going to the stove in one movement, looking at the pot. I said so, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at his father. Grant looked at the coffee and at Thomas and at his son's worried face. It is a good first attempt, he said. We will work on it. Thomas exhaled. Maude poured the burned coffee out and started fresh, moving around the kitchen with the efficiency of many years of mornings. And Grant sat at the table and pulled Eleanor onto his knee, because she was still small enough for it, and would not be much longer. And he listened to her description of the book she was reading and her opinions about it, which were extensive. And Thomas sat across from them with his recovered dignity and his plan for the day. And outside the window the Nevada morning was coming in over the hills, gold and blue and vast, and the ranch was alive with the sounds of a day beginning. And the coffee, when it was ready, was exactly right. Maude set the full mugs on the table and sat down in her chair, and looked around at her family, Grant with Eleanor on his knee, Thomas with his careful plans, Bear under the table, the window open to the morning. And she thought, with the same clarity she had brought to everything in her life, with the same directness that had carried her off a stage in Colton Creek with a carpetbag and a dead man's name, and the stubborn intention of making something real. This is it. This is the whole of it. This is what all of it was for. And the morning came in through the window, and the coffee was hot and good, and the land was theirs, and the name on her journals and her deed and her heart was Merritt, chosen and true and entirely her own. And they sat together at the kitchen table in the growing light and ate their breakfast and talked about the day that was coming. And it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in the world.